Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one. Welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. Got a fair bit to talk about this week, and I'm already bracing myself for the shitstorm of negativity in the comments section, but, well, if I was worried about that, I wouldn't be doing videos on Star Wars Outlaws now, would I? Yeah, we're going to be talking about that. But first, in other news this week, what the hell happened to Concord? This was a game that completely slipped under my radar. I mean, I'd never heard of it. I didn't even know it was coming out. But it was next to impossible to miss the news about its sudden and spectacular demise. I mean, I suppose in a way it's not entirely impossible to see why I wouldn't have heard of it. Because it's a hero shooter. It's a live service hero shooter. It's an Overwatch clone. But even so, it was a major game published by a major publisher, Sony. And wow, it crashed and burned fast. I mean, probably shouldn't be too surprised because live service. I mean, there have been some successful live service games. Fortnite probably being the flagship live service title, but the problem is the publishers look at the success of something like Fortnite and they think, I fancy a slice of that dollar. And so they develop and publish their own competitors. But the problem is, the nature of the live service business model relies on a game's players playing that game exclusively. The way a live service game is set up is to keep you playing for as long as possible in order to screw you out of as much money as possible, chasing after the next milestone, whether that's the next unlock or the next loot box or whatever. And if you're playing one live service game like Fortnite, you don't really have the time to play another one. So the publisher of any new game of this type is always chasing after a diminishing return because there's only so many players available to try a new live service game if they're already heavily invested in another one. Now, one tactic is to try the approach of developing something that at least looks and feels different to established dominant players in the market. I mean, Fortnite is very sort of simplistic and cartoony, and so you could try a different cosmetic approach, but at the end of the day it's still a live service game, and well, that in itself is leaving an increasingly bad taste in people's mouths because the whole point of a live service title is to keep you playing for as long as possible, to screw you out of as much money as possible. And a lot of people object to that purely on moral grounds, which is entirely understandable. And also the nature of the gameplay tends to be very, very repetitive because you're essentially just doing the same thing over and over and over again. Which has led to not many big successes in the live service market and a whole bunch of high profile and spectacular failures. And you'd think that the publishers would realise that this is a very, very difficult market to break into, and it's a very expensive market to try to break into, and the chances of success are very, very limited. You'd think that, but, well, the only thing that seems to surpass the greed of big publishers is their stupidity, which leads to seriously expensive, high-profile failures like Ubisoft's Skull and Bones, Warner Entertainment's Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. And I'm deadly serious about the stupidity here, by the way. I know it's fashionable to say that games publishers are idiots, but there's no other way to explain some of the decisions and explanations that they come out with. I mean, when Suicide Squad Kills the Justice League became the huge failure that a lot of people predicted it was going to, Warner Brothers, who really should have seen it coming, I mean, the situation was entirely their own fault. They took the developers of the world-famous and excellent Batman Arkham series, single-player, story-heavy, great games, and said, okay, stop what you're doing. We want a live service game, because they're chasing after that Fortnite dollar. So a bunch of developers with zero experience of doing multiplayer in general and live service in particular suddenly found themselves making a multiplayer live service game. And when it crashed and burned spectacularly, Warner Brothers actually said, and I'm not making this up, while acknowledging how difficult it was to make a successful live service game for all of the reasons that I've already gone into, as a result they were going to be focusing more on the massively successful single-player story-driven games like the previous year's Hogwarts Legacy, also published by Warner Brothers, and the best-selling game of 2023. That thing shifted 22 million copies. No, of course they didn't. They acknowledged how difficult it was to create a new intellectual property in the live service sector, and said that they were going to be shutting down more single-player games in order to focus more on live service titles in the future. It's like they learned nothing from the failure of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, because of course they learned nothing from it. They're idiots. It was the same thing with Microsoft and Redfall. Take a successful, well-established developer of engrossing and best-selling single-player games, and then tell them to make a live service title, and then stand around like a bunch of idiots with your mouth hanging open in utter shock when it flops spectacularly. Well, how could this have happened? Gee, I don't know, Phil Spencer. I can think of a couple of reasons that clearly escaped you. And even when they do get a surprise successful hit of a live service title, the publishers seem to go out of their way to deliberately sabotage it, like Sony with Helldivers 2, which came out of nowhere, was a massive success, and then Sony decided, actually, we don't want all of this positive press. Let's force everybody playing the game to sign up for a PlayStation Network account on PC, where you don't need a PlayStation Network account in order to play the game, because we also published it on Steam. But no, we've got an investors call coming up, and we want to show some kind of growth. So let's deliberately alienate as many people as we possibly can, and force PC players to sign up for a service that they don't want or need. Yeah, that's a good idea. Who could possibly object to that? A decision so monumentally boneheaded that even the game's developers were telling people to ask for refunds in order to force Sony to back down. Just unbelievable. And this brings us back to the sudden and spectacular failure of Concord, because Sony are also Concord's publishers. Now, like I said, I don't know a huge deal about Concord, beyond the fact that it was a live service hero shooter. Big deal. The fact that it's flopped probably shouldn't come as a huge surprise for all of the reasons that I've already gone into. But what was surprising about Concord was just how quickly it flopped. I mean, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is still struggling on despite low player numbers. The same with Redfall. But Concord is gone. It took 2 weeks from the date the game was published to the server being switched off and Sony telling everybody they could have their money back. On the plus side, I suppose you should commend Sony for acknowledging that the game was an abject failure and at least giving everybody their money back over it. Something that Ubisoft didn't do with the disastrous pre-launch of Star Wars Outlaws. Yep, we're getting on to Star Wars Outlaws now. The main topic of today's video. So what exactly am I talking about here? There were 3 different editions of Star Wars Outlaws that you could buy. The base game for $70, or the gold edition with 3 days of early access and a season pass for $110, or the ultimate edition with the 3 days of early access, the season pass, a whole bunch of cosmetic shit that you shouldn't want or care about for $130. The base game is the only version you should ever pay for. In general, because you really do need to stop encouraging games publishers to rip you off like this. If you keep pre-ordering and you keep buying more expensive versions of the game, you are only encouraging them to keep doing exactly what Ubisoft was doing in the case of Star Wars Outlaws. Taking content that was available at launch and which should have been included in the base game and sticking it behind a paywall. Every one of you who bought anything other than the base edition of the game is to blame for publishers who keep doing this sort of thing. In particular, however, that 3 days of early access. Now, before I go into the specifics of why the early access in Star Wars Outlaws was a massive rip-off, genuine question, because I honestly cannot think of a single example. Can anybody name one occasion in the last couple of years when early access for a new game was anything other than a complete disaster? Genuine question, because I just don't know. I can't think of a single example. I know, again, looping back to Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, the early access for that was an unmitigated failure. Certainly nobody got their money's worth out of it because the servers were down more often than they were up. If you pay extra for early access to a new game title, essentially all you're doing is giving the developers money for the privilege of beta testing their servers. Now, that wasn't really an issue with Star Wars Outlaws. As far as I'm aware, the servers would... I don't even know if they ever went down. You know, they were pretty stable. The issue with Star Wars Outlaws was everybody who bought the gold or the ultimate editions of the game in order to get those 3 days of early access. When the game was actually released, on day one, it came with a day one patch in order to fix some game-breaking bugs that could get you stuck and not be able to continue the story. Well, this is a good thing, right? Well, not if you'd paid for the early access, it wasn't, no. Because it necessitated a complete restart of the game. The patch wouldn't work with existing saves. So, if you were dumb or desperate enough to give Ubisoft money in order to beta test their game, you pretty much got exactly what you deserved. You had to restart and completely... I mean, some people in those 3 days of early access got 20 hours into the story. More or less the point where it really does start getting good. All wasted. Complete waste of time and money. In order to not run into any of these game-breaking bugs, you basically had to restart the game on launch. So, what compensation did Ubisoft offer to players who had paid extra for early access? Don't forget, in some cases, people were paying almost double the cost of the base price of the game. An extra $60 on top of the already eye-watering $70 asking price for the standard edition. I mean, okay, you could argue that if you bought the most expensive version of the game for $130, then as well as the 3 days of early access, you were getting a bunch of cosmetic crap. But if you had bought the second most expensive version of the game, the only thing that you got extra was the 3 days of early access, and that cost you an extra $40. So did they get $40 worth of compensation for the complete waste of time that was the 3 days of early access? No. Ubisoft offered everybody 100 Ubisoft store points and a cosmetic item for your in-game ship. And if you'd bought the Ultimate Edition of the game, you already had the cosmetic item for your ship. Oh, it's not funny, I know. Well, it kind of is. Because if you paid extra, well, you got exactly what you deserved. So, yes, the fact that Ubisoft, who are scumbags, are the publishers of Star Wars Outlaws, is a good reason to not buy Star Wars Outlaws. Not just to avoid pre-ordering or buying enhanced editions, just to not buy the game at all. That is a perfectly valid reason to not buy Star Wars Outlaws. But it is not a good reason to not like Star Wars Outlaws. There are good reasons to not like the game. It's not perfect, and it's absolutely not going to be to everybody's taste, but simply the fact that it's published by Ubisoft is not one of them. Hate the publisher by all means. Ubisoft are an eminently hateable publisher, but judge the game on its own merits. And here's the part of the video where I am definitely going to get myself in the shit, because there are two guaranteed surefire ways of getting yourself in the shit on the internet. One, say something bad about Star Wars. People will not forgive you for that. And two, say something good about Star Wars, because there's a whole bunch of other people who won't forgive you for that either. Nevertheless, there are definitely things about the game that are disappointing. In the open world section of the game, there are a whole bunch of climbing puzzles, in the same way that you had climbing puzzles in games like Assassin's Creed, Uncharted, the Horizon Zero Dawn series of games. The difference is that in all of those games that I just mentioned, the climbing puzzles are really good. In Star Wars Outlaws, which is a real surprise because, let's not forget, this is from the publisher of Assassin's Creed that kind of set the bar for climbing puzzles in games. But in Star Wars Outlaws, yeah, they're fine. I mean, they work, but they're definitely not the best example of this kind of thing. Then there's the stealth sections. And again, we're talking about the publisher that brought us Splinter Cell and Assassin's Creed. Games that set the standard for stealth gameplay. Now, I actually kind of like the stealth gameplay in Star Wars Outlaws, but I know, hear me out. Don't worry, I've seen the YouTube videos as well. I know exactly what you're going to say. But the thing that you have to bear in mind when you're referencing some fairly well-known examples of just the most idiotically boneheaded and apparently blind, deaf and dumb AI guard routines where you can just walk right past an NPC guard and they're completely oblivious to your presence is that generally you're watching somebody who has not only equipped a full set of stealth gear, but they've also unlocked a whole bunch of stealth abilities. Does this lead to some comically unbelievable situations? Yeah. yeah, it absolutely does. You've seen them all on YouTube. Is this great game design? Yeah, maybe not. But, I mean, the point I'm making here is that there's a reason within the game mechanics that explains why sometimes the AI can just react as if they're asleep on the job. Could it have been done better? Oh yeah, 100%. Absolutely. Just look at Assassin's Creed or Splinter Cell. Oh, and you can also come across the comical situation where, you see, a lot of the time, depending on your reputation with the faction that the guard belongs to, you can be standing in front of one of these guards and they just won't give a shit. I mean, why should they? You're a respected member of the Hut cartel. They're a Hut guard. You're just standing in the street minding your own business. But then you take one step forward and suddenly you're in a Hut cartel restricted area. And the guard goes, oh, you shouldn't be here. And they go on the alert. And then you take one step back and you're just out in the street again. You're no longer in the restricted area. And the guard immediately loses interest. So it does look stupid. But there are reasons why it works like that. Could it have been done better? Yeah. But the thing that you have to bear in mind here as well, and this is in stark contrast to the earlier examples I was given about established single-player story game developers that suddenly had live service games foisted onto them to develop by the publishers, the exact opposite has happened here with Star Wars Outlaws. It's developed by Massive Entertainment, who are known for multiplayer live service games like The Division 2, Avatar, the Pandora whatever thing that came out last year. And now they're making a single-player game. And I think they've done a reasonably good job. It is far from perfect. But one thing that they have done, actually two things that they have done, is make it feel like Star Wars. And they've also made it not feel like a Ubisoft game. Now, I do love me a bit of Star Wars. I mean, there was a point where you could have put a piece of shit on a shingle and stamped it with the Star Wars logo, and I would have said it was the best thing ever and paid you any amount of money for it. I have become a little more discerning, however, particularly since the release all the way back in the early 90s of the Star Wars Special Editions, when George Lucas added a whole bunch of unnecessary and controversial shit to my beloved Star Wars episodes 4, 5 and 6. And then things only got worse with the release of the Star Wars prequels, and then they got infinitely worse with Disney Star Wars and the Star Wars sequels. Oh, and by the way, if you love Clone Wars era Star Wars, you know, the prequel trilogy, that's great. That's absolutely fantastic. I mean, I get it. I understand. I think that they're objectively bad movies, but I don't have any issue whatsoever with people who grew up with that era of Star Wars. I mean, I was the same with the classic era of Star Wars. And, I mean, Return of the Jedi isn't without its issues either, although I had to get a bit older and wiser before I realised it. I'm talking about the Ewoks here, of course. Do you know they were originally supposed to be Wookiees? Because I can totally get behind the idea of a tribe of Wookiees allying with the rebels and tearing the arms and legs off a bunch of Imperial stormtroopers. But a bunch of 3-foot-high teddy bears? Yeah, not so much. I mean, I loved the Ewoks at the time, and I still, despite acknowledging that they were basically a merchandising opportunity to sell plushies, I still kind of have a soft spot for them. But I'm not blind to the fact that they were basically nothing more than a merchandising opportunity to sell a whole bunch of soft toys and plushies. But here's the thing. The internet appears to have a really hard time acknowledging the possibility that it is entirely possible to both love something and yet still be able to acknowledge the objectively bad things about it. The thing I find personally with Disney Star Wars, modern Star Wars, you know, the sequel movies and the TV shows, is that a lot of it is objectively bad. The sequel movies, utter trash like the Obi-Wan TV show or The Acolyte. Now, I happily acknowledge that I do have a critical blind spot when it comes to classic era Star Wars. And if you're a generation younger than me, it's entirely understandable if you have a critical blind spot when it comes to prequel era Star Wars. And if you're 8 years old, it would be entirely understandable if you had some kind of critical blind spot when it comes to Disney era Star Wars. Stuff like the sequel movies, The Acolyte, and the Obi-Wan TV show. On the other hand, if you're not 8 years old, again, I can understand if you have serious issues with Disney-era Star Wars too, because I think it's fairly safe to say that an awful lot of people are starting to get really sick and tired of having Disney force their agenda down our throats and using Star Wars to do it. I get it. And in fact, I actually agree with you to a fairly large extent. However, here's the thing. All of these people who rage against gender politics and identity politics and all this stuff being shoehorned into Star Wars, while I do agree, I mean, I'm getting thoroughly sick and tired of trying to watch Star Wars and just being told that I'm a bad person and I need to think differently and educate myself. Yeah, that really annoys me too. But this is where the internet appears to have developed something of a blind spot, because not all of Disney Star Wars is like that. I really loved Rogue One, a Star Wars story. I actually kind of liked Solo, a Star Wars story, even though it wasn't as good. The first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian were fantastic. The Andor TV show was unbelievably good. But this is where it's very, very easy to get yourself in the shit. Because if you try to point this out to the haters, if you go onto social media and try to say, well, I actually kind of liked this Disney Star Wars, you'll get destroyed by the haters. But at the same time, if you go into social media and said, I really didn't like this Disney Star Wars, you get destroyed by the die-hard Star Wars fans who can't accept you not absolutely 100% committing to whatever it is that they love. Doesn't matter which side of the divide you fall on, you're going to get destroyed by somebody. You're either a corporate Disney shill, or the other side label you as a basement-dwelling incel troglodyte who just hates women. And God help you if you try to take the middle ground and say, well, actually, you know, there's some parts that I like and there's some parts that I don't like, because then you just get destroyed by everybody. And I feel like Star Wars Outlaws falls into this middle ground, which isn't doing it any favours whatsoever, because it means it just gets dumped on by everybody. It's not great. I mean, there are parts about it that are distinctly mediocre, and there are parts about it that are objectively bad. But there are also parts about it that are really, really good. And I am forced to acknowledge that I am probably looking at it with a bit of a blind spot, because it's classic era Star Wars. It's my Star Wars. It's set between the events of The Empire Strikes Back and The Return of the Jedi. And one thing that it 100% does very, very well is nail that classic era Star Wars look and feel. So I'm probably being a little bit too generous with it because of that. But even taking that into consideration, I am still enjoying it. It's one of those games where I wake up every morning and I want to play. And the last time I could say that about a Ubisoft game was Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And that was nearly 10 years ago. I mean, you know, by all means, if you want to punish Ubisoft, because God knows they deserve your punishment, do not buy Star Wars Outlaws. But try to judge the game on its own merits. And by that I mean make your own opinions. I mean, it's very, very easy to make something look bad in a 3-minute YouTube video. It's also very, very easy to make something look good in a 2-minute movie trailer. I actually went to see The Phantom Menace because it looked good in the trailers. Don't allow yourself to be manipulated. It's one of the reasons why I do these videos. It doesn't matter whether or not I love something. The point is, I show you the gameplay so you can decide whether or not you love something. And if you've watched the gameplay and you think, yeah, actually, no, this looks kind of shit, I think I'll pass. That's 100% fine. I've done my job. You know, I've saved you wasting money on buying a game that you don't like. Everybody's happy. Except nobody's happy. Because you can't say anything good about Star Wars, and you also can't say anything bad about Star Wars. It's just pick which side you want to get destroyed by. And heaven help you if you try to take the middle ground, because then you just get shit on by absolutely everybody. And unfortunately, the middle ground is where I live. So anyway, it sucks to be me. And that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know it's going to have given you something to talk about in the comments, and I look forward to seeing what it is that you have to say. In the meantime, as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.